It began in June of 1967, deep in the rust-stained heart of upstate New York, when the small town of Elmhurst woke to a headline so grotesque it didn't seem real. A young couple, barely a week into their honeymoon, had been found brutally murdered in their rented lakeside cabin. Their throats slit clean through, rings missing, bodies arranged side by side as if placed in mock devotion. The local sheriff said it looked like a ritual, but the coroner's report later called it a message. And if that message had words, it would have whispered, "We enjoyed this." Before we descend into the grim descent of what became one of the most disturbing killing sprees in American relationship history, I want you to take a moment wherever you are right now to look around you. What time is it there? Because somewhere in that quiet moment, another story just like this one might be beginning. Now, let's go back to where this one started. At first, there was no connection. The victims were clean-cut, middle-class, newlyweds, ordinary, wholesome Americans. There was Michael and Anna Becker, both 27, married barely 8 days before their bodies were found in the rented cabin at Lake Sycamore. Their wedding pictures showed smiles too wide, too hopeful. No one knew that just hours after those photographs were taken, their paths would cross with two strangers who would later be described by investigators as the embodiment of evil wrapped in human flesh. Their names were Leonard Harker and Evelyn Grace, a couple whose love was not built on affection but on blood, domination, and the thrill of killing. Leonard was 39, a former vacuum salesman from New Jersey who had an unshakable charm, the kind of man who looked you in the eye too long. Evelyn was 34, a nurse's assistant dismissed from a state hospital for emotional instability and inappropriate attachment behavior. When they met in 1965 at a singles dance in Trenton, witnesses said it was instant, like two people recognizing their own reflection in darkness. For months after that dance, Leonard and Evelyn vanished from sight. What police would later discover were dozens of letters between them, letters that dripped with obsession, control, and strange promises. Evelyn wrote lines like, "I want to be a knife, my darling," while Leonard replied, "Then be sharp enough to draw blood when I tell you to." The first murder came almost a year later, though it would take investigators another 5 years to realize it was theirs. That was a newlywed couple from Pennsylvania, found in a motel off Route 19, both strangled with the same scarf, their wedding rings gone, their luggage burned. The coroner noted the killer left no fingerprints, no semen, no identifiable evidence, just a faint trace of violet perfume on the woman's hair and a cigarette stub crushed into the man's chest. At the time, no one saw the connection, but Leonard and Evelyn did. They called it our first dance. Evelyn's diary, later recovered from her sister's attic, revealed the psychology behind their madness. "We take what they have," she wrote. "Not money, not things. We take their love and we destroy it, because no one should love more than we do." She believed every couple they murdered somehow fed their own relationship, made them stronger. Leonard encouraged this delusion, nurturing her fragility until it became a weapon. He called their acts celebrations. Each killing took place within 10 days of a couple's wedding, each murder more brutal than the last. Investigators later theorized Leonard studied local newspaper wedding announcements, picking targets based on honeymoon destinations. He was methodical. He was precise. But Evelyn brought the chaos, the unpredictable, emotional violence that turned each crime into something ritualistic. By August 1967, 3 newlywed couples were dead across 3 states, Pennsylvania, New York, and Vermont. And still, there was no clear pattern. The FBI only became involved when the press caught wind of the honeymoon butcher, a name the media invented after the 3rd case. But what reporters didn't know yet was that there wasn't just one butcher. There were 2, and they were in love. The press frenzy grew, and with it came public panic. Motels reported cancellations, small-town wedding venues shut down, and the fear spread like infection. Yet Leonard and Evelyn watched it all unfold from their small rented house in Rochester, reading headlines aloud to each other over breakfast, laughing as they did. Evelyn often circled the victims' photos with red lipstick, writing beneath, "They should have stayed home." Investigators initially thought the killer was a man who targeted women, a misogynistic drifter. But the violence didn't fit. There were signs of two sets of hands, two minds working in harmony. One victim's wrists bore small crescent nail marks, consistent with female grip, while the husband's bruising suggested a larger male aggressor. But no one wanted to believe a woman could be part of something this depraved. That disbelief, detectives would later admit, allowed Leonard and Evelyn to keep killing for years. The case only began to turn when a gas station attendant near Albany reported a suspicious couple traveling in a blue 1959 Chevrolet, too affectionate, too quiet, and paying with cash only. Police dismissed it. Days later, another honeymoon couple vanished. When the Beckers were discovered in June stabbed, stripped of their rings, and arranged in that grotesque pose, the pattern finally clicked. Investigators cross-referenced wedding announcements with missing persons reports and found something chilling. Every single couple had married within the past 2 weeks, every destination was publicly announced, and every killing occurred in or near the location printed in the local newspaper. Leonard and Evelyn were reading about them, hunting them. It was Evelyn's job to track addresses, Leonard's job to kill. Together, they were a system. But what no one could have predicted was how much of their motivation was rooted not in money or revenge, but pleasure. The act itself bonded them. According to Evelyn's surviving diary entries, she described their murders as moments of perfect silence, where she felt closer to him than ever before. Forensic psychologists later studying the case noted an eerie pattern in their timing. Each murder occurred following a documented argument between Leonard and Evelyn. Their violence was, in essence, foreplay and therapy. Kill to reconcile. Kill to feel love again. And the scariest part, it worked for them. Their relationship deepened with every life they ended. They were inseparable. Each other's addiction, each other's mirror. But all addictions, even murderous ones, eventually demand too much. And that demand began tearing at their fragile illusion when a surviving witness emerged, a young motel clerk from Burlington named Tommy Sloan. He saw them the night of the third killing. He remembered Evelyn's perfume, her trembling hands, the way Leonard called her darling, as if they were play-acting normalcy. When police questioned him weeks later, he was too scared to tell the full truth. He only said, "They looked happy." Weeks passed. The investigation grew colder. Leonard and Evelyn shifted their hunting grounds westward, moving toward Ohio under false names. But inside their home, something dark was changing. Evelyn began keeping mementos, rings, photos, fragments of fabric. Leonard disapproved at first, calling it sloppy, but later began to enjoy the trophies himself. In one recovered Polaroid, the two posed smiling beside a wall covered with wedding announcements. Each one was marked with an X. In another, Evelyn was seen holding a bride's veil, her eyes distant, almost reverent. Their obsession wasn't with killing itself, it was with love. The idea of it, twisted and inverted. They couldn't stand the thought of anyone loving freely when their own love felt poisoned. And yet, they couldn't stop. By autumn of 1968, 4 more couples had vanished. Police still had no names, no leads. Then, as winter approached, something happened that would change everything. A routine traffic stop outside Syracuse. A patrol officer pulled over a blue Chevrolet for a broken taillight. Inside, a man and woman matching no known fugitives, friendly, cooperative, offering neat answers. The officer noticed nothing unusual until the woman leaned forward and he caught a faint scent violet perfume, that same fragrance listed in the Becker autopsy, but he let them go. It would be months before that decision came back to haunt him. And by then, the number of victims had doubled. When the winter of 1968 crept across the Northeast, so did the quiet terror that no one could name. Every small town, police station from Vermont to Ohio, had a case file marked "Missing Newlyweds." It became a phrase that carried a chill whenever it was spoken. Detectives compared notes, studied maps, and still, no single thread tied the cases together. But in the background of that confusion, Leonard and Evelyn kept moving, careful, invisible. They weren't the type to draw attention. They stayed in motels, used false names, paid with cash, and blended in with the very couples they envied. To neighbors, they looked like a traveling salesman and his shy wife. To themselves, they were the perfect pair, bound not by conscience, but by secrecy. Inside their small rented home in Toledo, investigators would later find notebooks, pages of lists, names, locations, even sketches of rings and initials. Leonard was methodical, building what looked like an archive of love stories he planned to erase. Evelyn kept photographs, newspaper clippings, and items she said made her feel closer to them. The disturbing detail wasn't the keepsakes themselves, it was how carefully she arranged them, like someone preserving memories rather than covering crimes. Psychologists later believed this obsession reflected Evelyn's deep resentment toward the happiness she saw in others. She and Leonard didn't just end lives, they targeted the very idea of joy that reminded them of what they lacked. As the investigation widened, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began to develop what they called a two-part psyche. One personality dominated, charming, persuasive, the other submissive yet unpredictable. They theorized that one of the pair sought control through manipulation, while the other found purpose through devotion. Together, they created a cycle that thrived on secrecy and destruction. But they also left behind traces of themselves, patterns, habits, symbols. And that pattern was about to lead investigators closer than they realized. In early March of 1969, a young couple named David and Laura Bennett disappeared while traveling through Pennsylvania on their honeymoon. Their car was found abandoned in a wooded area near an old diner. Inside were 2 untouched slices of pie, still on the counter, and the owner remembered something odd. A man and woman sitting a few booths away, watching the couple closely. They didn't eat much, he said later, just kept smiling at each other, like they knew something the others didn't. The description matched Leonard and Evelyn almost perfectly. It was the first solid lead authorities had in nearly 2 years. But by the time investigators retraced their steps, the couple was gone. The Bennett disappearance became a turning point. The FBI formed a multi-state task force, interviewing witnesses from every previous case, combing through public records, and reviewing hundreds of newlywed announcements from local papers. One detail emerged that none of them could ignore. Each of the missing couple's weddings had been listed in the society section of their hometown newspaper, often including honeymoon destinations. Someone had been reading those pages carefully, marking them like a shopping list. This discovery terrified people across the country. Newspaper offices began receiving panicked calls from families, demanding their announcements be removed. It became a national headline, "A newlyweds being hunted." The fear transformed small towns into fortresses. Motels installed extra locks, wedding parties canceled travel plans, and for a while, the nation held its breath. But while the world was afraid, Leonard and Evelyn felt stronger than ever. In her surviving diary entries, Evelyn wrote, "The more they fear us, the more we belong to each other." To her, the headlines were proof of their significance, a twisted validation. Leonard, on the other hand, began to grow cautious. The attention unsettled him. He wanted to stop traveling, settle somewhere no one would find them. But Evelyn refused. She needed the ritual, as she called it. The act of pursuit had become her way of proving love. That difference, her hunger and his hesitation, was the first crack in their once perfect bond. In April 1969, investigators received an unexpected break. A photograph, mailed anonymously to a local paper in Buffalo, showed a man and woman sitting in a parked car. The image was blurry, but the details were unmistakable. The woman's pale scarf, The man's sharp suit, the car's distinctive grille, a blue 1959 Chevrolet, the same car noted in earlier reports. The sender left no message, only a short sentence typed beneath the image. They smile because they know you'll never find them. The letter traced back to an abandoned post office box in Ohio. Detectives searched, but found nothing but dust. It was a ghost trail, but it proved something vital. Someone had seen them, someone who wanted them caught or wanted the world to know they were still out there. That spring, the killing stopped for a time. No missing couples, no strange reports, no headlines. It was as if the Honeymoon Killers had vanished. In truth, Leonard and Evelyn had retreated. They rented a small farmhouse outside Akron under false names and tried to live quietly. For a few months, it almost worked. Evelyn tended to the garden. Leonard took a job repairing appliances. They attended church once or twice, even invited a neighbor over for tea. To outsiders, they were polite, if distant. But the peace didn't last. Evelyn grew restless. She began keeping to herself, sitting for hours reading old newspaper waiting sections, tracing names with her finger. Leonard noticed the change. He knew what it meant. The pattern was returning. By July, Evelyn had convinced Leonard to take one more trip, one last celebration, she called it. They drove west toward Illinois, claiming they wanted to visit relatives. In truth, their route mirrored another newlywed couple's itinerary, Robert and Elaine Morris, who were traveling to Chicago for their honeymoon. It was as though Evelyn needed to prove their bond again through destruction. Leonard, torn between fear and obsession, agreed. But this time, something went wrong. The couple checked into a hotel under their real names, a mistake that would become their undoing. A week later, when the Morris couple vanished, investigators traced the hotel registry. There it was. Leonard and Evelyn Harker. The handwriting was unmistakable, identical to signatures on Leonard's employment forms in New Jersey years before. For the first time, law enforcement had real names. The FBI issued nationwide bulletins describing them as armed, extremely dangerous, and operating together. The manhunt began in earnest. Roadblocks went up. Newspapers plastered their faces across front pages, but Leonard and Evelyn had already slipped away, heading south, changing cars, changing names again. The trail grew cold until a quiet tip from a mail clerk in Kentucky broke the silence. He told police that a woman matching Evelyn's description had been renting a small post office box under the name Mrs. L. Harper. She came every Friday morning, alone, always wearing gloves. Surveillance teams were deployed, and one overcast morning in September 1969, agents finally spotted her. She wasn't in disguise, wasn't running. She simply walked to the counter, collected her mail, and left. They followed her to a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Inside, Leonard waited. The walls were lined with photographs, rings, and handwritten notes, evidence of everything they had done. The FBI surrounded the building that evening. Neighbors heard shouting, then silence. When agents entered, the apartment was empty. The back window had been pried open, curtains fluttering in the night air. They were gone. All that remained was Evelyn's final diary entry, dated the night before. We can't be caught. We belong to no one. We end only when we choose. It would be nearly a year before anyone saw them again. By the summer of 1970, the story of Leonard and Evelyn had grown into legend. Newspapers called them the ghost couple. No confirmed sightings, no new disappearances. Some investigators believed they were dead, others that they had fled overseas. But there was one man who never stopped searching, Detective Samuel Hartley, the lead investigator from the New York division who had followed their trail since the first discovery at Lake Sycamore. Hartley was methodical, quiet, and obsessed with finding answers. He once told a colleague, "They're still out there. They enjoy the fear too much to stop." Hartley spent months reviewing the case files, building timelines, tracing every possible route the pair could have taken after Kentucky. he noticed something subtle. The letters, for example, appeared faintly stamped on a few hotel check-in logs from Tennessee, the initials of Evelyn Grace. It was enough to keep him going. While most of the bureau had moved on, Hartley followed his intuition, and that intuition would lead him straight into the final chapter of one of America's darkest manhunts. Meanwhile, Leonard and Evelyn had found refuge in a small town outside Nashville, renting a house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood under new identities. They posed as a married couple named Mr. and Mrs. Hill, blending into local life as if nothing had ever happened. Leonard took repair jobs. Evelyn volunteered at a thrift store. They seemed normal. To their neighbors, they were polite, even kind. But beneath that calm surface, the same sickness that had driven their earlier crimes began to resurface. Evelyn's need for attention, Leonard's need for control, it all simmered in silence. And soon, their calm disguise began to crack. The first sign came from a local librarian named Martha Keene. She recalled Evelyn visiting the library weekly, asking for wedding announcements and engagement records. At first, it seemed harmless, but the persistence made Martha uneasy. She mentioned it to a friend who happened to read about the Honeymoon Killers case. The description, dark-haired woman, quiet manner, unusual interest in wedding news fit too closely. Martha reported it to local authorities, who passed the tip to the FBI. Detective Hartley was immediately notified. He boarded the flight to Tennessee within hours. When Hartley arrived in town, he began observing quietly, working with local law enforcement to verify the lead. It didn't take long before he spotted them himself. Outside a small grocery store, a couple stood beside an old sedan, him tall and composed, her nervous and watchful. The moment Hartley saw Evelyn's distinct features, he knew it was them. He followed discreetly, taking notes, learning their routines. They lived quietly but cautiously, always locking windows, never using phones, never staying out past dusk. To any passerby, they were invisible. But to Hartley, every move spoke of guilt and fear. He began planning their capture carefully, unwilling to risk another escape. The surveillance went on for weeks. Hartley gathered photos, spoke with neighbors, traced their mail, and even recovered fingerprints from discarded envelopes, all matching earlier evidence. He now had proof beyond doubt. But before authorities could make a move, something unexpected happened. Evelyn began visiting a nearby chapel every Thursday afternoon. She'd sit alone, lighting a candle, staying for an hour before returning home. Witnesses described her as distant, lost in thought, sometimes whispering under her breath. Hartley later wrote that she looked haunted by her own conscience. On October 22nd, 1970, the operation was set. Agents surrounded the Hills' rented home at dawn. Hartley, leading the team, waited for Leonard to leave for work. When he stepped outside, officers moved in. Leonard didn't resist. He simply looked at Hartley and said, "You finally found us." Evelyn, however, was found inside the house, sitting at a small table, her hands folded over a stack of newspaper clippings. On top was an old photograph of one of their victims' weddings, now faded and creased. She didn't speak a word as agents escorted her out. The search of their home revealed an astonishing level of documentation. Files, letters, and newspaper cuttings detailing each couple's life. Like a macabre scrapbook of obsession, investigators noted how Leonard had categorized everything: dates, locations, even coded symbols marking their successes. It was less about trophies and more about control, the desire to keep a record of dominance over others. Evelyn's writings, on the other hand, revealed guilt intertwined with justification. She wrote, "We never wanted to harm anyone. We wanted to feel what they felt." Those words became a haunting centerpiece of the later trial. News of the capture spread nationwide. For a generation haunted by fear and speculation, it felt like closure. Reporters flooded the courthouse steps, demanding answers. People wanted to understand how two seemingly ordinary individuals could live double lives for years without being discovered. During questioning, Leonard remained composed. answering carefully, often minimizing his role. Evelyn, in contrast, was conflicted. She alternated between remorse and defense, sometimes claiming responsibility, other times insisting Leonard made her do everything. Psychologists would later call it a shared delusion, where both individuals reinforce each other's darkest impulses until morality dissolves completely. The trial that followed in 1971 was unlike any other. The courtroom was filled with tension, curiosity, and disbelief. Families of the victims sat silently as evidence was displayed: letters, photographs, the timeline of events. Prosecutors painted a picture of manipulation and psychological dominance. They argued that Leonard's charm masked his cold calculation, while Evelyn's emotional instability made her both a follower and a catalyst. The defense claimed they were deeply disturbed, victims of each other's influence, not driven by cruelty but by delusion. The jury listened for weeks as experts debated whether this was a story of evil or madness. Detective Hartley testified on the fifth day. His calm recounting of the pursuit, the evidence, and the final arrest captivated everyone in the courtroom. He described Leonard as a man who believed love was something to possess, not to share, and Evelyn as someone who mistook destruction for devotion. His closing statement lingered in the room long after he left the stand. They didn't just take lives. They took meaning from love itself. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous. Both were found guilty. The court sentenced them to life imprisonment without parole. Reporters described the moment Evelyn heard the decision how she looked at Leonard, expecting comfort, but found none. He kept his eyes forward, expressionless. That silence between them was said to be more haunting than any outburst. It was as if their strange, consuming bond had finally broken. In prison, they were kept in separate facilities. Letters between them were monitored, then eventually stopped altogether. Evelyn's health declined, while Leonard became withdrawn. Over the years, rumors circulated that Evelyn often spoke to herself, repeating the names of the victims as though seeking forgiveness. Leonard, meanwhile, refused interviews, spending his days reading history books and avoiding other inmates. Detective Hartley retired not long after the case concluded. He never sought fame or credit, though journalists often approached him for commentary. In one rare interview, he simply said, "They taught me something: evil doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers." The story of Leonard and Evelyn Harker faded slowly into the archives of American crime history, remembered only by those who studied obsession and control. Yet, even decades later, the fear lingered. People still whispered about them when newlyweds disappeared unexpectedly, as if their shadows still loomed quietly over the idea of love itself. And somewhere in a forgotten box, in a courthouse basement, their photographs still sit side by side, two faces frozen in time, smiling faintly, bound forever by their darkest secret. Years passed, and time began to blur the edges of the story that had once terrified the nation. The year was 1983 when the world last heard of Leonard and Evelyn Harker. They had spent over a decade in prison by then, separated by distance but forever connected by what they had done. Though they no longer shared letters, both continued to live in the shadow of the past they had built together, a past that could not be erased, only studied, remembered, and feared. Inside those walls, their names became quiet legends among staff and inmates alike. People described them as two people who looked ordinary but carried storms behind their eyes. Evelyn grew frail, spending most of her days in the prison infirmary. Nurses said she would often stare out of the small barred window, watching the birds that perched on the fence. Sometimes she'd whisper something they couldn't quite hear, a name, perhaps a memory. Her old journals had been confiscated years earlier, but she continued writing on scraps of paper torn from letters or food wrappers. She wrote in loops and circles, repeating phrases that made little sense. To her caretakers, she seemed lost between guilt and denial, trapped in the memory of what she and Leonard had once called their love. Leonard, however, was a different kind of prisoner. He was polite, quiet, and followed every rule. He worked in the prison library, rarely speaking except when spoken to. God said his eyes were cold, calculating, detached, but not cruel. Some described him as a man still holding on to control even when stripped of everything. When asked by a reporter years later why he thought they had done what they did, Leonard answered simply, "Because she wanted to be loved, and I wanted to be the only one who could give it." That one sentence became the most quoted line of the entire case. It revealed more about their twisted psychology than any expert testimony ever could. Outside the prison walls, the memory of the Honeymoon Killers faded from headlines, but not from public consciousness. Documentaries were made, authors wrote books, and students of criminology debated the case for years. Was it manipulation or mutual destruction? Could two people truly lose themselves so completely in obsession that they destroy everything they touch? These questions had no easy answers. But one thing became clear: the Harker case changed how law enforcement studied relationships in crime. It was no longer just about motive or opportunity, but about the unseen power of influence between two unstable minds. Detective Samuel Hartley, who had led the original investigation, passed away quietly in 1986. In his final recorded interview, he reflected on the case that had defined his career. "I used to think monsters were born," he said. "Now I believe they're made piece by piece, choice by choice, until there's nothing human left to save." His words echoed in classrooms and training seminars long after his death. Even today, young detectives still study his notes on the Harker case as an example of patience, intuition, and the psychological depth required to confront evil when it hides behind love. Years later, in 1991, Evelyn's health declined further. Prison officials reported that she spent her final months in silence, occasionally humming a tune that no one recognized. When she passed, her only remaining possession was a small folded piece of paper. On it were just 3 words written in her careful handwriting: "I still remember." The paper was kept in her file, sealed away as evidence of her final thoughts. Leonard was notified of her passing but showed no visible reaction. He simply requested to visit the prison chapel the next morning. Witnesses say he sat there alone for hours, staring at the candles without speaking. No tears, no anger, only silence. After that day, Leonard withdrew even more. He refused interviews, stopped speaking to guards, and no longer worked in the library. He seemed like a man waiting for something, perhaps peace, perhaps nothing at all. When he finally passed away in 1998, the warden described his final moments as quiet and unremarkable. There were no visitors, no family, and no words. Just an end that arrived like a whisper after decades of echoes. The two were buried separately, miles apart, their graves marked only by numbered stones. Yet, in the files that remain, their names still appear together, side by side, forever linked by the darkness they once shared. In the years that followed, the legend of the Honeymoon Killers transformed into a cautionary tale. Professors used it to discuss the psychology of obsession. Journalists revisited it to question how love can twist into something dangerous when guided by control instead of compassion. Some called this story a tragedy of the human mind. Others saw it as proof that evil can disguise itself in the most ordinary faces. But for the families of those who were lost, there was no philosophical meaning, only grief that never truly faded. Every anniversary brought new pain, and every new generation rediscovered the case with a shudder. To this day, visitors at Lake Sycamore claim that the old cabin where the first victims were found still stands, though abandoned and falling apart. Locals say they sometimes hear faint music from the water at night, as if someone were replaying the echoes of the past. It's probably just the wind, but those who know the story never stay there after dark. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the memory of what happened there lingers like a stain that time cannot wash away. The case of Leonard and Evelyn Harker remains one of the most studied examples of shared delusion and moral collapse in American criminal history. Their crimes were not driven by profit or anger, but by a distorted reflection of love, a reminder that darkness can grow in the most unexpected places. They showed the world that danger does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers sweetly, disguising itself as affection until it's too late to turn back. And perhaps that's the most chilling truth of all. Not the acts themselves, but how easy it was for them to seem ordinary while hiding something so wrong beneath the surface. If you've stayed with me through this unsettling journey, thank you. Stories like these remind us that real horror isn't found in monsters, it's found in the people who look just like us. If you'd like more stories about the shadows history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe to Dark History HD, give this video a like, and share it with someone who loves unraveling the mysteries of the past. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.